This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this Friday's show with our grain market update for the week from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Today, Dan shares that local planting will most likely begin to take precedent in influencing our U.S. markets as producers in our area begin to plant both corn and soybeans. The show continues with K-State Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. Today, Ignacio shares insight on the various considerations to keep in mind when planting soybeans this year in Kansas. We end this week's programming with a cautiously optimistic agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip shares insight on the precipitation and storm conditions that affected parts of the state this past week, but also hints at the potential for more widespread precipitation in the week ahead. That and more's coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are beginning today's show with our weekly grain market update, and joining us for that, as always, is K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Today, we wanted to kind of highlight, I think the general theme will be that obviously planting is starting here in the U.S., and that's going to start taking precedence in what we see in our markets, I think, right?
Yes, in terms of the factors that will be in the minds or on the focus, on the radar of market analysts and participants in the grain futures markets, they'll tend to be watching planting progress, the amount of moisture we have, any either good news or bad news that comes into play. Now, for the last several months, we've been watching that same type of thing down in Brazil, Brazil and Argentina. But now with our planting season is coming up, we'll take on more of a domestic focus, I think. And, with that, you stand back and just look at this situation, and we generally have decent moisture in the eastern two-thirds of the United States. Lots of moisture, too much up in the northern plains, but we're still dry here in the west. And gosh, Samantha, this is just a replay almost of last year, when we had the same situation develop and turn dry out here in the west. And to me, I think it'll behoove us in coming weeks and months to watch what basis does here. Basis being the differential between local prices and the Chicago Board of Trade. And if we continue to have dry weather, I would think it would lead to stronger basis than our local differentials in our prices relative to the rest of the U.S. than we're seeing at this moment.
Sure. So a bit wider margins there, like you mentioned. You said we're kind of at the same point this year as we were last year, but I would say the compound effects that we've seen, we're in a worse place this year than we were this time last year.
Well, we are. And from having tight stocks, tight supplies, and then start coming, at least at this point, moving into that same situation, we don't have much in the way of carryover stocks to guide us through. So I think that even though we're not talking about cattle today, that the people I hear from or hear about most are the people with grass and just not having enough forage available, having to look at a second year of this, sell down cow herds. Of course, that affects what I'm interested in for sure on hay markets, and that same dryness is a looming specter out there. And when we start talking about planting corn, planting grain sorghum, planting soybeans, sunflowers, and harvesting wheat in the next 1 or 2 or 3 months.
Well, I'll share that there is some optimism today in our later segment with Chip Redmond. Stay tuned for that, folks, because there's a bit more of an optimistic outlook on the horizon. It might not be the overnight difference maker, but it's something.
Now the grain market is watching the weather report. So what Chip says, what others say is a big, big thing. That may be taking the lid off a little bit on some of our dryness. That would be just extremely welcome. But the point now, though, is that farmers have to, plant by faith and hope it comes up so that when that moisture does come, hopefully later on, that they'll be able to benefit from it.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, now that we've kind of given an overview of what we're going to discuss today, let's get into really our usuals that we discussed at the beginning, our futures and then cash prices.
Yes, recent trends in corn and in soybean markets have been generally sideways to a bit higher. It's interesting that, to me anyway, that corn closed yesterday 663 3/4. It had been as low about 2 or 3 weeks ago in early March as 610 got up to about 685, closed at 663 and thereabouts now. So that, from a corn producer's point of view, is a pretty positive thing. On soybean side, also some strength has been revealed. Of course, the big low came again about mid-March at about 1405 thereabouts. Got up to, since that time, about 1530, and that has been hanging right around $14.95, $15 on the May contract. So that's generally been a positive thing. Wheat had gotten up, had been pretty strong. It jumped up to just under $9, closed down to $8.40 right now. And it's a challenging, puzzling issue. You know, we have the Kansas Wheat Tour coming up just within a few weeks. And I really wonder what those folks will see when they get out in the country here to the west. Some moisture has come, and that's surely welcome. I think it's a question for Romulo, Lulato, and our other agronomists to wrestle with the idea of how can moisture that would come now help plants that have been under so much stress to actually recover it, and what's the probability of that happening? And you know, the U.S. hard red winter wheat production for this year and the market scenarios going forward, whether we're tight or not, will likely depend heavily on the answer to that question.
Sure. Yeah. Those wheat tours coming up, fast approaching, I think, on the minds of many here at K-State in our extension offices. And I know those are currently being scheduled and I think are soon to be released. So stay tuned, folks, for those times.
Yep. You know, and in terms of other issues, just to hit on a few things happening, you know, we're still looking at, for corn markets, still the overall world and U.S. situation is still relatively tight. The USDA projections have been optimistic for this year, and I think the market's paying attention to those optimistic projections. But I guess the latest numbers that have come out are world minus China stocks to use at about 10.3%. That's near historic lows that we've had of late. Cash prices last year averaged $6.60 per bushel. The USDA's projected $5.60. You look at the futures right now, they're projecting for the next marketing year about $5. So we have some real differences of opinion that have come about here. I guess from a similar point of view, in the wheat market, the USDA is projected about $8.50 for this coming marketing year, starting June the 1st. We were at $8.90 last year. You look at the futures now, and they're projecting for this coming year about $8.15. So again, a real differential in opinion on where the markets are going. For soybeans, a similar situation. You look at this current marketing year that we're in, about $14.30. Tremendous price for soybeans. But USDA is projected for this coming year $12.70, and that coming year would start September 1st. And that's not too far off of what the futures are projecting. They're projecting about $12.84. So generally, the overall issue is that keeps repeating itself, is that we come out of a high price year. Overall, it seems that the markets at this time are anticipating dialing in better crops, higher stocks to use. And I think for the overall farm sector, we're hoping for those bushels to be produced. But if not, then their price expectations are pretty low. And you know, through May, June, July, and August, we'll be wrestling with that uncertainty and looking at the financial implications on the farm sector in the U.S. and Kansas based on that outcome.
You know, we always look to the futures for some sort of guidance, but just a reminder that they're not always fully accurate in these situations.
Well, they're not fully informed, you know, and right now, so their assumption is that we'll have good crops. And I think in most years, that's a very, very good assumption. But I guess for us in Kansas, when we see such dryness in our neighborhood, it's hard to not wonder about the possibility of that assumption being wrong. So like I say, we'll be watching planting progress, the health of the crop, et cetera, as we go forward. One thing that has to certainly be overcome is just dry soils. But when you look at percent topsoil, percent subsoil rated good to excellent, it's pretty stressed right now. And the strong majority of our topsoil and subsoils in Kansas anyway, and in these western states, central and southern corn belt, are dry in a dramatic fashion. So we do need moisture coming, and not just a little bit. And hopefully we can refill the soil profiles and end up with good crops. And our best outcome over time, and I know, again, we've talked about this, is when we have lots of bushels and decent prices. That's when we tend to make the most money in farm country. High prices can mask a real shortage of bushels from a drought or whatever. And so we're hoping to avoid that outcome.
You're talking about local conditions. So is there anything locally that we should be watching market-wise in the past week or so?
New crop bids for corn, as we kind of wonder about where the markets might go this fall. You've got the strongest bids, of course, in Garden City, at least as of on yesterday's closes on Thursday, the 20th, $6.13. That's a 56-cent basis. That forward contract price being above December 23 futures. And compare that to a place like Salina at $5.42, where the new crop forward contract bids are 16 under. So you've got a real differential. And it's based on Southwest Kansas being a market center with lots of livestock feeding and some ethanol plants. So and around the state, you also see pretty strong prices in Hutchinson with a positive basis and in Colby. So there's still the signals are still being sent to ag producers that we certainly want you to plant these crops. We're giving you a pretty good forward contract basis, and to see something positive is useful. For wheat, I think that's the next crop we'll be harvesting, of course. Forward contract bids for new crop, strongest bids are $7.92, $7.91, and that's pretty consistent. Topeka, Garden City, Hutchinson, Colby just behind us $7.85, Salina $7.83, even Columbus at $7.69. So pretty good prices. But again, the issue there will be more the bushels. And our producers willing to forward contract and tie in commitments to deliver bushels when they have such uncertainty out here in the field. And that's really the conundrum on wheat at the moment.
Well, we appreciate you joining us to share this information in such a fast format, so it's easy for producers out there to learn everything that they need to. So thanks so much for joining us today, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Samantha. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti, and he's joining us today to talk about some soybean planting considerations for Kansas this year. Ignacio, this year is an interesting one, to say the least, in terms of our current conditions, and with that comes a lot of considerations, right?
Yeah, again, some thanks for the invitation. From the beginning of the season, you start already seeing some of the issues and dry conditions. Completely different growing season as compared to even the last one, which was very challenging, one of our most challenging growing seasons in the last several years. But so far, this is promising to be more challenging, and we hope things are changing, forecasts changing midsummer. But so far, I will tell you that most of the conditions across the state are looking not that good. And then soybeans are complex, very complex crop. And we start thinking about planting recommendations in terms of planting day and maturity group. We usually go back and revisit some of the data that we have in terms of optimal planting day and maturity groups. We know that when the farmers are taking decisions right now, they're trying to think about when is the optimal planting for soybeans, and then what are the length of maturity that they need to use on the varieties. I will tell that if you look at our information in terms of our maps, someone might say, well, that's a little bit outdated. And I will say, why? Well, if you look at what farmers tend to do today, they start shifting in the last couple of years of planting soybeans first and then corn. And that shift is slowly moving in many regions in the state. We have, for example, the Northeast, that our range of normal recommended planting dates was before, saying May to June, so the entire month. And then today we have some farmers that they already planted. And they usually were planting before corn, which is something that you start saying, what's going on?
Yeah.
Most of the situations when we discuss with some of these farmers, is connected to looking for better scenarios for corn, because first you want to make sure that you use most of your days available to plant. Mm-hmm. Compared with previous years or growing seasons, you see that we are not talking this season, almost we shouldn't be talking, I would say, about available planting dates. Because if you think about the available planting dates for this season, we haven't had much of a problem. In previous growing seasons, we have rains, and we have a lot of rains during this time of the year and also in May. So when you look at your available planting dates and suitable planting dates, you will see that sometimes you have, in 1 week, you have only 1 day, and the next week you have probably 2 days because of the rain, because of the drying down of the soils this year. I mean, one of the reflections is when you look at the progress in planting. In corn, we are ahead of planting. I think that we are ahead closer to 10-11% of planting compared to the average.
Wow. Which
basically give us a reflection of it's quite dry. If we have any rain, that rain basically lasts only for the trafficability of soils, like maybe a day, and then the next day you're ready. That's all. So we are quite dry. And if you look at the growing season, one of the things that I always emphasize on soybeans is your planting window is very wide. We talk about Northeast going all the way from some guys already planting, and you could plant soybeans all the way to June with no problem. If you look at even Southeast, we have farmers that they start planting. Their optimal is more between May and June. They usually try to delay the planting in Southeast, in many situations to avoid stress conditions late in the summer. And then if you look at the western side, we start seeing more soybeans moving west, and you have the same situation. Some farmers are already putting soybeans, but most of that optimal planting is usually around, again, May and June. And then also we start thinking about maturity. And then we talk about this multiple times. The selection of maturity goes in many situations with planting dates. So if you are planting early, you have a chance to use a longer maturity. In many situations, if you are in central or south, you can use group 3, 4, or 5 if you are extreme south. As you are delaying your planting dates, we start seeing that we shouldn't cut too much on maturity, because in fact what happens to the plant, even if we go, what I'm saying late, even if we go after mid-June, we have situations when the plant is changing on the sensitivity to the light duration, and then after June 21st we have less number of hours. So we start going down a number of hours after that point. If you start shortening your cycle, those plants will start to keep very short with less leaves, and mainly you have less chances to produce yield. So in many situations we always say try to keep the maturity, and when is the moment that you need to decide to trigger or to change your maturity is usually when you are already way too late. If you are getting into July, if you are getting into double cropping, you might consider there in some situations, mainly because you know that if you go with a very long, you will not be able to finish it because of freeze problems at the end of the season. So, and the other aspect, looking at planting time, and I emphasize this with many people, even with the ones that are planting really early, I say if you plant soybeans April 10, and with the temperatures that we have today, and with all the fluctuations of ups and downs, you might take for those soybeans to come up maybe 20 days. So you might plant in April 10 and you will get those plants up maybe May 1st. For those guys that are planting in much better conditions of soil moisture and temperature, the other farmer in May 1st, if you have optimal temperature and moisture, you might get those soybeans up in May 7 or 8. So at the end of the day, when you look at the real number of days that you win by anticipating your planting by 3-4 weeks, there might be only 5 at the end of the season. So think about these scenarios, because maybe it's more because of logistics, because you want to get things done and get it over with, which I understand that.
Yep.
And many times that's mentality, not only for farmers. It happens in many places. But also, it's important to understand that you are not doing that with the purpose of having longer seasons. Sometimes you are only just having a few days more. And then what you need to think is if you go into too early, you might also see situations like a lack of uniformity. And in corn, we talk a lot about lack of uniformity, because if you look at early season when the plants are coming up, you want to make sure that those plants are coming almost all at the same time, so the temporal. And also you want to see that they are, especially when you look at the field, separated in a similar distance. And that is critical for corn. And we have a lot of research data showing that if you have asynchrony and if you see plants coming up like 2 or 3 weeks after, those plants, they tend to become weeds. They are never with a canopy. They're never like in a population they don't feel part of. And they get to flowering, they get late, and sometimes they don't even put an ear. So basically it's like leaving a plant behind. And you start doing your stand counts, but if you are seeing that some plants have 5-6 leaves, and then this plant probably has only 2 or 3 leaves. And when they're already that much behind, you basically are producing a plant that is using resources but is not being fertile and not being productive. And that's a problem in corn. On soybeans, we tend to see a similar problem, but it's not as big as corn. But on soybeans, we always mention these to farmers. We say plant uniformity is not a big factor, but if you can take care of that, that will be another factor that will help you to yield more. And more in the situations where you have fields with compaction or pH problems, anything that is basically making those plants to go slow, it will make an impact. Because if you have plants that they are going slow, growing slow, and then you have ones that are coming 2 weeks after, then you will create more disuniformity. And in those environments, we tend to see penalty in yields.
Sure. So there's more of like an underlying story in those situations.
Exactly. In your best fields, that uniformity will not penalize much because the plants, they have ability to compensate. They can put more branches. If they find the resources of water and nutrients, these plants are phenomenal in plasticity. But be careful, because if I'm going to fields that I already presenting some challenges early season, high pH, I mentioned compaction, nutrient deficiencies, think about potential problems, and many of you experts in the field, you know where are your issues. Where are the places where plants are not growing well? If you go on those situations, you plant too early, and then you have problems because you didn't have enough rain, or the plants are not coming up. Those are environments where this delay on coming and this lack of uniformity can penalize yields. Mm. And we have documented that a couple of years ago, and we say that be careful in those situations. If you already know that you get into those environments, one way to solve it quickly is to adjust your seeding rates. I mean, if I already know myself that I'm getting into an environment that is challenging, I will probably start looking at increasing my seeding rates at least in 10%. Making a small adjustment, nothing crazy, but something to compensate because I'm expecting that these plants will have a challenge to be effective. So think about these scenarios in terms of planting their maturity groups. So we have, again, I will emphasize, we have a very broad, open planting window for soybeans, okay? And sometimes my recommendation when I discuss with many farmers is don't put all the eggs in the same basket. Mm-hmm. I mean, diversify your risk. You can go first to the best fields, but make sure that you separate your planting dates so you kind of diversify your strategy to make sure that you can produce yields.
Absolutely. And that starts with knowing your own operation, I guess, at the heart of all of this, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Ignacio, this is great advice for all those producers out there getting ready to plant soybeans. And like you said, some already starting, kind of crazily enough. But advice for this year going into the 2023 season. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti joining us again for a conversation on soybean planting this year. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we're ending today's show, as we always do, with this week's agricultural weather report. And joining us for that this week is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this past week, some precipitation across parts of the state.
Parts of the state. Yeah, we had an event come through Friday night as expected. Pretty good band of rain that moved through central and eastern parts of the state, and then a little bit of light moisture for the western Kansas folks, but barely enough to tip the gauge a few times. But still, it's positive progress after some of the areas in central Kansas and even eastern Kansas went 50 days without a wetting rain. So much needed moisture. And unfortunately, as with any moisture we get this time of year, we have thunderstorms as well. We really brought that to fruition with the next round of rain that we saw. That was on Wednesday night into Thursday, mostly focused in, once again, the same areas, central and northeast Kansas. But another round of needed moisture and severe weather that came with it. I know our Elmdale Mesonet station down there in Chase County had a close encounter with a tornadic circulation, measured 85-mile-an-hour wind. That's pretty cool, but not cool for the people that live out there. But the important thing is we're getting moisture now in the eastern part of the state where we've been dry over the last month, and we're shifting that gradient just a smidge further west every time, and I think that's a good trend that hopefully we can carry through.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned, 50 days without rain for some of those people, but the Southwest, it's been close to 6 months for some, right?
Yeah, there's over 250 some days since a quarter inch of moisture has been measured in the Southwest. And unfortunately, that kind of came to fruition with another dust storm event that we saw overnight Wednesday into Thursday with that strong cold front. They had 50-some mile-an-hour winds and zero visibility at night. And that's rare we see this kind of events at night. And just goes to show how dry the exceptional drought is out there.
You said we're on El Nino watch is kind of the language you used before we hit record here. So what does that mean for the next week or so ahead?
Yeah, so El Nino watch is more big picture stuff. That's refers to ENSO. We've gone to neutral, and now the expectation is that we're probably going to be in El Nino by summertime. That's kind of long term, but it's really interesting that just in the last week, we've kind of had an El Nino taste in the weather pattern. We're going to see that continue for the next week. And part of that's due to the Madden-Julian oscillation finally coming into our favor as it moves around the northern hemisphere. But that means moisture chances stick around, which is positive. And right now, as of this recording, most of the state is forecasted to get moisture through the next week as a couple storm systems slide to our south, which is a big break in the pattern. And we've seen the systems go over us into our north. And so that would bring in much cooler northeast flow and moisture, hopefully for everybody.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I know that's welcome news for most of us across the state.
Yeah, we got 2 chances of it. It looks like that Monday, Tuesday time frame, and then again on Wednesday and Thursday. And hopefully we can get some moisture in the soil.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned cooler temperatures, and with that comes potential for freeze in western parts of the state?
Yeah, we've been really warm. We've been 20-plus degrees above normal on a lot of these days with some even 90-degree readings out there. And we're going to flip that switch a little bit now as that pattern shifts a little bit further south. That brings cooler air down and will be cooler for afternoon highs, about 5-10 degrees below normal. And then at night, that means we're going to be flirting with 32, especially for central and western parts of the state. The wheat crop's not quite progressed nearly as far in those areas, if it even came up in a lot of them. So I think the overall freeze or frost risk is relatively low, and hopefully folks didn't jump the gun and get their gardens going.
Yeah, absolutely. Just something to be mindful of. Might need to cover up some of those early planted crops.
Yeah, but hopefully bring them in because hopefully they're not in the ground yet. Our soil temperatures have obviously bumped back up with these warmer temperatures, and we saw just a week ago where we were 50s for most of the state. They're going to obviously fall a few degrees over the next week.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, for the most part, a change of pace for us. Some good news, hopefully, in the next week or so with some rain on the way.
Yeah, hold on to that. The new Climate Prediction Center outlooks came out for May, and right now they went with equal chances. So a little bit uncertainty, and mainly that's because we're probably only in a week or two buck the trend kind of event right now. As we get back into May, I would not be surprised to see us get warmer than normal and drier. But Climate Prediction Center doesn't say that we're going to weigh one way or the other. So let's stick with that positive trend into May.
Absolutely. We'll take that more than the other opposite side of that. So thanks so much again for joining us today, Chip.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ending this week's programming with our agricultural weather report. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.